He wasn't supposed to die that day. Not after everything he'd survived. Not after spending a lifetime defying gravity itself. January 16, 2021, the world watched in awe as a small group of Nepali climbers, led by Nirmal Purja, stood triumphantly atop K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, in the dead of winter. It was something that had never been done before, a miracle carved from ice and willpower. But just hours later, while the mountain roared with frozen wind and silence swallowed the celebration, one man began his final descent. His name was Sergio Mingote, a Spanish climber, an iron-willed athlete, a dreamer who had already conquered so much. He was supposed to meet the team below, to share in history. Instead, he fell. No one saw it happen. No one heard his last words. All they found was his body, shattered and still, on the icy slope between Camp 1 and Base Camp. How could someone like Sergio, disciplined, strong, a man who climbed more peaks than most could dream, die on a day of triumph? What went wrong? Was it exhaustion? A hidden crack in the ice? Or was it something deeper? Something about K2 itself that refuses to let anyone leave unscathed? Because here's the truth about K2. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how many records you've broken, how many medals hang around your neck. On that mountain, even victory can kill you. And before we dive into the life and final climb of Sergio Mingote, a man who touched greatness and paid the ultimate price, take a moment to follow K2 stories. Because this is more than a story about death on a mountain. It's a story about ambition, sacrifice, and the price of chasing the impossible. Before K2 claimed him, Sergio Mingote had already lived a dozen lives worth of triumphs and transformations. Born in 1971 in Parets del Vallès, a small town near Barcelona, Spain, Sergio wasn't born into the mountains. He was born into motion, a boy who couldn't sit still, whose heartbeat always matched the rhythm of pursuit. His story didn't begin with an ice axe. It began with a dream of endurance. From a young age, Sergio was drawn to challenge, to the kind of effort that hurts and heals at the same time. He trained as a long-distance runner, competed in triathlons, and eventually became one of Spain's most respected endurance athletes. He held university degrees in physical education and management, even served as a mayor for 7 years in his hometown. But underneath the suit and speeches, there was always something else, a restlessness, an unspoken whisper from the wild that said, "You don't belong behind a desk." That whisper became a roar the first time he saw the Himalayas. He was no longer content to run marathons or lead people from behind a podium. The mountains called, and Sergio answered. By his early 40s, Sergio was already chasing 8,000-meter summits, the world's highest and deadliest peaks. What made him different was his philosophy. No oxygen, no shortcuts, no limits. He believed in pure climbing, the kind that strips you bare and forces you to meet your truest self at the edge of death. In just a few short years, he climbed 12 of the world's 14 8,000ers, often solo, often in record time. He climbed with grace, discipline, and that rare calm confidence that comes only from knowing who you are. Other climbers respected him not for his fame, but for his humility. He was the kind of man who would pause on a climb just to check if another climber's glove was torn, or to share a thermos of tea in the thin air. But beneath the calm, there was drive. A burning desire to do something extraordinary. To leave a mark not for glory, but for meaning. K2 in winter was the one summit left that could give him that. The impossible mountain, unclimbed in the harshest season. To reach it would be to stand in history. When Nirmal Purja announced the all-star team attempting K2's first winter ascent in 2020-2021, Sergio joined as part of a parallel international effort. The mission was not a competition, but a shared goal, to prove that human endurance could defy the mountain's cruelest season. He was 49, at the peak of his maturity as a climber, strong, wise, and deeply committed. He told his wife, "If I can help open the way for others, it will be worth every step." He knew the risks. K2 in winter had already killed dozens. Temperatures dropped below -40°. Winds screamed like freight trains. The mountain was pure hostility, a vertical slab of death and beauty intertwined. But Sergio wasn't reckless. He was measured, methodical. Every expedition was an equation, every step a calculation of risk and rhythm. Still, his friends noticed something different about him that winter. He was quieter, more introspective, almost as if he sensed the weight of what was coming. As he prepared for the expedition, Sergio wrote on his journal, "Each climb is a dialogue with myself. The mountain doesn't take lives, it reveals them." He didn't know it then, but those words would echo louder than any applause he'd ever receive. And so, with the winter winds howling over the Karakoram and the eyes of the world fixed on the impossible, Sergio Mingote packed his gear, kissed his wife goodbye, and set off for Pakistan, chasing not fame but the essence of life itself, to do something that mattered, even if it meant never coming back. For Sergio Mingote, training was never about muscle. It was about the mind. He believed that summits weren't conquered by strength, but by focus, humility, and pain management. And few people had mastered pain like he had. After decades of endurance sports, Sergio's body was a map of quiet resilience. He'd run ultramarathons through deserts, cycled across continents, and climbed peaks where oxygen fades into myth. But his true preparation for K2 began years before, in a series of climbs that forged his philosophy. Pain is information. Listen to it, but don't obey it. He started with Manaslu, 8,163 meters, where he battled storms that tore tents from their anchors. Then came Broad Peak, Lhotse, and Makalu. Each summit added a layer to his armor, and each descent taught him humility. "You don't win against the mountain," he once told a journalist. "You negotiate with it." By 2018, he achieved something few climbers ever dream of: 3 8,000-meter summits in less than 100 days without supplemental oxygen. The world began to take notice. Magazines called him the gentleman climber. Sponsors lined up. But Sergio never changed his rhythm. Still polite, still unassuming, still obsessed with self-improvement over headlines. His friends joked that Sergio was part scientist, part monk. He logged every detail: calories, altitude gain, oxygen saturation, pulse, even his moods. He said that knowing your limits is the only way to stretch them safely. Yet there was an unspoken rule in high-altitude climbing. The line between discipline and obsession is razor thin. In 2019, while descending from Dhaulagiri, Sergio witnessed another climber lose his life. It wasn't the mountain's fault. It was a misstep, a lapse in concentration. That night, he couldn't sleep. The fragility of life above 8,000 meters haunted him. But instead of retreating, he doubled down, refining his systems, testing his endurance, meditating daily. To him, climbing wasn't gambling with death. It was learning how to coexist with it. When word spread that Nirmal Purja, the Nepali powerhouse who desummited all 14 8,000ers in record time, was assembling a historic winter expedition to K2, Sergio was captivated. Winter K2 was the ultimate proving ground. The last great unsolved riddle of the climbing world. Temperatures dropped to minus 60 degrees C. Winds screamed over 200 kilometers per hour. Frostbite could claim a hand in seconds. It had turned back every team that had tried before. Even legends like Reinhold Messner called it madness. But to Sergio, it wasn't madness. It was meaning. Still, there were boundaries. In winter, climbers aren't just fighting cold. They're battling the calendar. Short daylight, longer darkness, slower acclimatization. Every wrong decision is magnified. Every rule ignored can be fatal. There's an unwritten law on K2 in winter. No ego, no hurry, no mistakes. Sergio understood that law better than most. He wasn't aiming to outshine the Nepali team or claim a flag on the summit. His mission was quieter: to climb clean, to support, to bear witness to human endurance in its rawest form. He wanted to show that unity, not competition, could push humanity further. Throughout 2020, while the pandemic silenced the world, Sergio trained alone in the Pyrenees. He slept in hypoxic tents to simulate the lack of oxygen. He ran at dawn, biked at noon, climbed at dusk. He was turning himself into a machine of precision, not for glory, but for survival. In one of his last recorded interviews, he said softly, People ask why I keep climbing. I tell them, it's the only place where I truly feel honest. That honesty, that inner dialogue with pain, was his compass. He knew K2 wasn't a mountain you conquer. It was a mirror that reflected everything you are, and everything you hide. So, when his flight touched down in Skardu, Pakistan, in December 2020, Sergio carried more than gear. He carried years of discipline, scars of lessons learned, and a quiet promise to himself. I will climb with respect. I will return with truth. He didn't know it then, but K2 was already whispering its own promise back. You will climb with respect, but you will not return. Winter on K2 doesn't forgive mistakes. It studies them, waits, and then punishes them brutally. By late December 2020, the small frozen town of Skardu had become a launching pad for history. Dozens of climbers from around the world, Nepali, Chilean, Polish, Spanish, Icelandic, gathered for one reason: to attempt the impossible. To be part of the first ever winter ascent of K2. For Sergio Mingote, this was more than another mountain. It was a dream decades in the making. He wasn't part of Nirmal Purja's core Nepali team, but rather climbing in parallel, cooperating with them when paths crossed. The spirit was unity. To see at least someone reach the summit in winter, to push human boundaries together. As base camp took shape at 5,100 meters, the mountain loomed above, black rock, glinting ice, and wind that screamed like a living creature. Every gust carried shards of snow sharp enough to sting skin through layers of Gore-Tex. The Karakoram range stretched endlessly, cruel and beautiful, as if sculpted by gods with no empathy. Each morning began the same: frozen boots, numb fingers, and tea that turned cold before you could drink it. The team spent days establishing camps up the Abruzzi Spur, Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, inching upward between avalanches and icefall. They fixed ropes, ferried supplies, and endured temperatures colder than the surface of Mars. But this was no ordinary climb. It was a war of attrition. The cold made metal snap, tents rip, and oxygen tanks malfunction. Frostbite ate through gloves. The human body simply wasn't built for this. The air was too thin, too dry, too deadly. Sergio kept a detailed log every night, handwriting trembling from the cold. -45 degrees, fingers stiff, breathing hurts, but the stars are like fire. I feel alive. That kind of optimism in hell defined him. While some climbers complained, Sergio smiled. He helped others repair gear, shared chocolate, and spoke softly about home, about his wife and students, about teaching people to find peace in struggle. By mid-January, after weeks of storms, the weather suddenly shifted. A window, small, fragile, perfect, opened. The Nepali team, led by Nirmal Purja, prepared for a final summit push. It was the moment everyone had waited for. On January 16, 2021, the Nepalis did what no one had ever done. They reached the summit of K2 in winter, standing together at 8,611 meters, singing the Nepali national anthem in unison. It was one of the greatest achievements in mountaineering history. Down below, Sergio was descending from Camp 1 after a long acclimatization rotation. He had congratulated Nims and his team by radio, his voice tired but proud. The weather was worsening again. The mountain was closing in. Everyone knew it was time to retreat before the next storm. The descent from Camp 1 is deceptively simple, a series of icy slopes and rocky sections, no more than 6,000 meters high. But on K2, nothing is simple. The route was glassed over with blue ice, ropes buried under snow, anchors loosened by temperature shifts. Visibility was poor. Around midday, as Sergio began his descent toward base camp, something went wrong. Some witnesses said they saw him slip. Others believe a rope failed. There are reports that he fell hundreds of meters tumbling down near advanced base camp. There was no scream, just the distant echo of movement, and then silence. When rescuers reached him, he was gone. His body lay motionless on the icy slope, face peaceful, still clipped to the rope. The news spread through base camp like a shockwave. Radios crackled, tents went quiet, and the celebration from the summit turned instantly hollow. The mountain had taken back its tribute. Nirmal Purja's voice, broken and exhausted, was heard over the radio. We did it together, but we lost one of our own. Sergio had been alive just hours earlier, strong, smiling. Now, he was part of K2's frozen history, another soul claimed by the mountain that never forgives victory. The Nepali climbers descended in mourning. Flags lowered. The celebration turned to prayer. Even in triumph, K2 had reminded them who was in control. In Sergio's pocket, rescuers found a small note he'd written days before. "Whatever happens, tell them I was happy here." It was not a message of fear, but of peace. The kind only a man who'd made peace with death could write. And as the storm rolled in, swallowing the route and erasing his tracks, K2 stood silent once more, proud, merciless, eternal. When the radio went quiet that afternoon, base camp turned into a cathedral of disbelief. Men who'd spent decades staring down death found themselves speechless. Sergio Mingote, the unshakable, disciplined, cheerful Spaniard, was gone. Just like that. No avalanche, no storm, no warning. A slip, a fall, and a life that had carried so much purpose was suddenly over. The shock rippled across the Karakoram. Climbers huddled in mess tents, staring at their teacups, unable to speak. Some wept openly. Others just stared toward the upper slopes where the wind screamed endlessly as if mourning him. For Nirmal Purja and his Nepali teammates, the victory on the summit now felt bittersweet. They had achieved the impossible, the first-ever winter ascent of K2, but as they descended, carrying frostbitten fingers and broken spirits, they knew the cost had been paid in full. K2 had taken one of their own. The next morning, January 17th, the sun rose cold and pale over base camp. News of Sergio's death began to spread beyond the mountain, reaching Europe by satellite phone. The Spanish embassy confirmed it. By midday, newspapers around the world carried the headline, "Spanish climber Sergio Mingote dies descending K2 after historic winter ascent." But the words felt wrong. He hadn't been reckless nor careless. He hadn't died on the summit, chasing fame. He died while returning, steady and careful, the same way he had always lived. Sergio's wife, Anna, received the call in Spain. For years she had supported his dreams, even when those dreams led him into the world's most dangerous places. Friends said she didn't cry immediately. She just sat quietly, hands folded, whispering, "He was happiest up there." In Pakistan, efforts were made to recover his body, but the conditions made it impossible. The mountain refused to release him. Eventually, his remains were buried under snow and ice, becoming part of K2's eternal silence. Days later, climbers erected a small cairn of stones near advanced base camp. On it, they placed a patch from his jacket and a small Spanish flag, fluttering weakly in the freezing air. A handwritten note read, "To Sergio, the mountain is quieter without your laughter. Rest easy, brother." Across the world, tributes poured in. The King of Spain expressed condolences. Fellow climbers shared stories of Sergio's kindness, how he carried another climber's pack when they were too exhausted to continue, how he always smiled even when frost clung to his eyelashes. But beyond grief, there was reflection. The climbing community began to ask, what does success mean if it costs a life? Was the summit worth the sacrifice? Some argued that winter K2 was simply too dangerous, that humanity had no business being there in January. Others countered that Sergio understood the risks better than anyone. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing human truth, that fragile line between courage and surrender. As days passed, the mountain was abandoned once more. The Nepali team returned home to global applause, their names etched into history books. But for those who had shared base camp with Sergio, the taste of victory was dust. His tent, still half buried in snow, stood empty. Inside were his notes, a worn notebook filled with pages of reflections, meticulous, thoughtful, deeply human. On the last page, written days before his fall, he'd scribbled a line in Spanish. "No somos dueños de la montaña. Solo somos invitados." We are not owners of the mountain. We are only guests. Those who read it felt chills deeper than the cold around them. In time, Sergio's death became more than a statistic. It became a mirror for everyone who dares to reach beyond reason. He wasn't the first to fall on K2, and he wouldn't be the last. But his story stood apart, not as tragedy alone, but as testimony. He had lived without compromise, climbed without ego, and died doing what he believed gave his life meaning. And for many who followed, that truth, though painful, was strangely beautiful. When spring returned to the Karakoram months later, the snows shifted, erasing tracks and tents. But the cairn remained, a silent marker to a man who gave everything, quietly, with grace. And the mountain, indifferent and magnificent, kept its secret. In the end, what remains of a man like Sergio Mingote? A few pages of notes, a smile frozen in photographs, a name carved into ice and memory. But for those who followed his journey, from the dusty roads of Spain to the merciless slopes of K2, what endures most isn't to the way he died. It's the way he lived. K2 has always been more than a mountain. It's a question, a test of what it means to be human. Why climb something that has killed one in every four who tried? Why walk into the heart of danger, knowing it might be your last sunrise? For climbers like Sergio, the answer was never about conquest. It was about connection, with the mountain, with oneself, with that quiet truth that only reveals itself when everything else is stripped away. In his own words, every step above 8,000 meters is a step closer to knowing who you are. That idea, that suffering can illuminate purpose, divides people. Some call it courage. Others call it insanity. After his death, debates raged across mountaineering circles and social media. Should humanity keep pushing limits that seem designed to destroy us? Or is that relentless push exactly what defines us? Veteran climbers argued that Sergio's passing was not a warning, but a continuation of a sacred tradition, the pursuit of meaning in places where meaning feels impossible. If he'd stayed home, one wrote, he would have died a little each day. Others disagreed, saying the line between bravery and obsession is too easily blurred. They saw his death as a reminder that even the strongest can fall, that mountains like K2 demand humility, not just from the climber, but from all who watch. Yet in that tension lies the beauty of his story. Sergio wasn't reckless. He was reverent. He treated the mountain not as an enemy, but as a teacher, one that offers lessons only to those willing to risk everything to learn them. And maybe that's what makes his final words, "Whatever happens, tell them I was happy here," so haunting. Because he was happy. In a place where most would find terror, he found truth. His legacy now lives in the hearts of those who dare, not to climb K2 necessarily, but to face their own mountains, the invisible ones, fear, doubt, regret. Because the essence of his life isn't frozen on an icy slope in Pakistan. It's alive wherever someone decides to take one more step when it hurts, to reach for something beyond reason. And so, when we speak of K2, let's remember, every triumph there is written in blood and wind. Every life lost is a chapter in a story far older and larger than any one climber. Sergio Mingote's chapter is one of dignity, purpose, and peace, a reminder that greatness doesn't always mean returning home. If his spirit could speak now, maybe he'd tell us not to mourn, but to listen, to the silence between heartbeats, to the whispers of ambition, to the wild that still calls us forward. Because that's what K2 does. It doesn't ask for applause. It asks a question. How far are you willing to go to find yourself? If stories like this move you, if you believe these moments of courage and consequence deserve to be remembered, then help keep them alive. Subscribe to K2 Stories, because some mountains should never be forgotten, and neither should the people who dared to climb them.